The following program is brought to you in conjunction with the folks at Grace to All with Paul Gray. Now we bring to you the Agape Guy Show with your host, Lenny Manning. Hello everybody and welcome to the Agape Guy Show. I'm your host, Lenny Manning. To start off, I'd like to give a word of warning that the things we're going to discuss on this episode are quite controversial. It might even trigger some people, so you might want to brace yourself. If you saw the last few episodes, you know that I started a series I call Understanding the Duns. I discussed the main reasons why the Duns are concerned about many aspects of typical conventional church groups. They've also seen some different things about several different subjects and seen some alternative ideas. Now, I have a lot of hope for the Duns because I've seen that a lot of them are learning about God's love. I've seen great things happen in people's lives as they learn about God's love. Now, I'd also like to say that I mean no offense or disrespect to anyone with anything I say here. The things I'm going to talk about can be a sensitive subject for some people. The subject I want to talk about today is the Lord's Supper, also known as communion or the Eucharist. We should all remember that this is a secondary issue, so it isn't a primary doctrine, so it's okay to have differing opinions on this subject. Now, I've done a bit of research on information about the Lord's Supper and looked at several sources. I've also heard some people talk about it in ways that are different than typical conventional church groups. I've heard some folks say that the typical traditional communion many Western evangelical churches have might be a bit off track. Some of the things I read were very eye-opening and upended a lot of the things I heard and was taught when I was young. I'll explain this further as I talk about this issue. I've gathered information on this subject from a few authors and scholars. These views may differ from what most typical Western evangelical church groups teach. Yet I would also say that the things that I found out about the Lord's Supper are all biblically sound. It's also backed up by a good study of history. I'll give some information which will make Bible verses about communion a lot more clear and easy to understand. I mean Bible verses that many churches use for communion, like 1 Corinthians 11:17 through 34. I'll also cite several sources for the information that I'll be sharing on the show today. These sources are authors, Christian speakers, pastors, researchers, and scholars. Some of these are folks like Mr. Gail Irwin, Bob George, Wayne Jacobson, Steve Atkerson, and Frank Viola. Steve Atkerson also cites multiple sources in his article about communion. Oh, I've also heard that Malcolm Smith talked about this a bit. You can find some of his videos on YouTube. I think he's even written a book about it recently. These authors and scholars have some very good insights on this subject. They also take in-depth observations of things mentioned in the Bible. They also take a look at what was going on that made the Apostle Paul feel the need to make some comments about it. These eye-opening insights from all these different folks reveal a lot about communion in the early church. So let's go ahead and start our discussion about the Lord's Supper. History shows that the early church seems to have celebrated communion as a potluck dinner. Sometimes they called it an ingathering or a love feast. These days, people might even call it a fellowship dinner. It likely wasn't a nibble of a cracker and a tiny sip of grape juice or wine. It was likely a full meal. The way the early church celebrated it had little or nothing to do with morbid introspection. Many church groups these days teach and practice this type of extreme introspection. They will have a special service that almost seems like a sad funeral. They'll have sad, somber music with everyone's head tilted down like they're sad. They'll tell people to remember all their failings and foibles in life and confess them to God. It ends up being a type of morbid introspection. I see it from a different perspective, though. It isn't about sitting in silence for several minutes to think up all your foibles in life to confess them to God. It isn't about sad, somber, and sullen funeral-style music. The historical perspective seems to show that it's about celebrating God's love. I hold to this more historical view of celebrating God's love. Some people actually believe in the presence of God in the Lord's Supper. Some people believe that this is where God places more of His grace upon us and in us. Some people also believe that when we see who our neighbors are and show kindness to them, we are showing God's love. That type of love means that God is among you and working within you. Thus, God's love will unite you where rituals and mere remembrances cannot. Sharing that type of love is what I believe it's all about. The comments in 1 Corinthians 11:17-32 that the Apostle Paul gave might not have been a warning, at least not warnings as many typical fundamentalist and evangelical church groups teach. It wasn't God threatening to wipe people out and end their lives. I've found different explanations for the meanings of 1 Corinthians 11 verses 17-32. These different explanations for these scholars seemed more thorough and complete. Typical evangelical teachings on this subject make God seem angry and as if He wants to wipe people out and end their lives. The Bible says God is love, so any teaching about God being angry and wanting to kill people seems skewed. It also seems like the explanations are incomplete or like they aren't giving all the information on the subject. I hold to the view that the problems the Apostle Paul addressed were with wealthy people mistreating the poor. These wealthy folks were followers of Jesus in Corinth who came to the potluck dinner in an unkind manner. Their unkind behavior manifested itself in a few ways. They considered the poor to be yucky, dirty, and unacceptable from a social standpoint. The rich brought fancy food that we would call high-class gourmet or delicacies. The wealthy folks brought high-class food and fancy wines. The rich folks didn't like to share with the poor people who likely had dirty and grimy hands. They didn't want the poor to get their dirty hands on their food and contaminate it. So the rich rushed to get in line first, so they could get their food before the poor could touch it. The rich folks then rushed to gobble down all their food as fast as they could. The poor ended up with little or no food left after they had waited in line. The rich folks would also hurry to drink their fine wines before the poor could get their grimy hands on it. So the rich folks, who should have shared with a generous heart, were depriving the poor and being very unkind. The rich also guzzled their wine so fast that they got quite drunk. They likely got so drunk that they did things that drunk people typically do. They likely talked in a belligerent manner and were rude toward other people. So a few things became visible, problems like those I'm listing here. 1. Some people weren't treating fellow followers of Jesus with respect or dignity as if God loved them equally. 2. They refused to recognize that God made other people in His image too, and that they should treat them with respect as well. And 3. Some people were being selfish and not sharing their abundance. 4. The love of God was getting pushed aside as well as the fruit of the Spirit. Yikes, that's not good. And number 5, some people were acting like arrogant snobs and like they were better than other people. So humility and hospitality got tossed aside as people got mistreated. Now, verse 21 is where the Apostle Paul talks about ways of solving some of these problems. This is where we dig in and get some solutions. Here's what the verse says. For in eating, each one takes his own supper ahead of others, and one is hungry and another is drunk. Paul talks about problems with people rushing to eat before others. This is also why he mentions the phrase, some folks go hungry. The rich ate all their food so fast that the poor at the back of the line couldn't get any food after waiting in line. This also explains why Paul mentioned that some were getting drunk. The rich folks were quick to guzzle their wine so the poor couldn't get to it and get their hands on it. Guzzling wine that fast caused them to get very drunk and act unkind because they were so drunk. This also explains verse 27 where Paul mentions eating and drinking unworthily. Here's what that verse says. Therefore, whoever eats this bread or drinks this cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of the body and blood of the Lord. Now, I don't think it's talking about that God saw them as unworthy, as if they were evil people who deserved to be wiped out. It had nothing to do with their sinning, going to hell, or God wanting to wipe them out. It means that they weren't showing that God's love was at work within them. If they had heeded Christ's teaching about God's love, it would be obvious that it was working in their lives. So it meant they weren't showing God's love from what other people had observed. So it's not that God found them unworthy to go to heaven. It was other people assessed them as unworthy or undesirable to be around because they were so unkind. It was also because the rich folks acted inhospitable and didn't extend any hospitality to the poor folks, so they weren't showing God's love. This is also why Paul mentioned in verse 22 about the reasons why they should eat at home. He was telling them it would be okay to eat their delicacies at home. This would keep them from succumbing to the temptation to become selfish with their delicacies. It would also help to keep them from harboring ill feelings toward the poor. No one was forcing the rich folks to bring their most extravagant food to the fellowship dinner. It was okay to bring regular food which most people were already familiar with eating. That would be more preferred than mistreating people or denying them their portion of food. Denying other people their portion of food likely made the poor feel disappointed, unappreciated, unwelcomed, and unloved. It might have also made them feel like an abandoned friend that no one cared about. Yikes, that's not good. Let's take a quick look at verse 29 and see what it says. Here's what it says. For he who eats and drinks in an unworthy manner eats and drinks judgment to himself, not discerning the Lord's body. The condemnation mentioned in 29 and 34 isn't talking about God's anger or desire to kill them. It wasn't God's condemnation, but the discerning eyes of other people. It means it was easy for everyone to discern for themselves if people were showing God's love or not. It was easy for them to see and figure out that God's love wasn't bubbling up from within some people. It was obvious when they acted like selfish snobs. Let's take a look at verse 30 through 31 and see what it says. It says this, For this reason many are weak and sick among you, and many sleep. For if we would judge ourselves, we would not be judged. The meaning of the phrase many being sick and asleep in verse 30 is about the kingdom within. The kingdom within was asleep and sickly. Or in other words, they weren't showing God's love. This doesn't mean physical death, as if God wanted to wipe some people out. It means that the kingdom within wasn't lively and hadn't come alive yet. They didn't yet have a thorough understanding of God's love. It could also be that they had a little understanding about God's love, but then backed away from it during these meals. So they were living in darkness, as in selfishness or arrogance or something like that. So it wasn't about physical death. They also might have liked their delicacy so much that it lured them into bad behaviors and being stingy. They needed to realign their lives with God's love at that point. God's love creates an obvious change that's different from living for oneself. It differs from our selfishness, egotistical, and arrogant mindset. God's love helps us become willing to engage in self-sacrificial actions for others. This led Paul to give some solutions in verses 33 and 34. Here's what those verses say. Therefore, my brethren, when you come together to eat, wait for one another. But if anyone is hungry, or if he's that excessively hungry, let him eat at home, lest you come together for judgment, or the judgment of other people, as not judgment from God. He tells them to tarry one for another, or wait for one another. He's telling them to wait for everyone to come in and get some food before they start eating. It was a way to make sure everyone got some food so no one got left out or deprived. This would also help everyone feel welcome and like they were among loving friends. It helped them feel like they mattered and they were as important as any other person there, including being as important as the rich and powerful, as well as pastors, prophets, and apostles. That sure would make me feel comfortable to hang out with those folks and eat with those folks. Paul also tells them in verse 28 to examine themselves, but I believe it means something different than we might think. I believe it means that we should make an honest assessment of ourselves. That is, to assess and see if they showed God's love and weren't straying away from God's love. This had nothing to do with morbid introspection, as some churches teach. We don't need to sit for a half hour and think of every tiny foible we make in life and confess it to God. This is a time to party and celebrate God's love. As Mr. Gail Irwin has stated, this is a whoopee time. This is a time to see God's love for yourself and make sure others can see it in your life as well, and to celebrate that. I also believe it's why the Apostle Paul considered it a serious problem and addressed it. People were getting mistreated, and some people weren't showing the love of God. The love of God should be our highest priority, or else we are really just wasting our time and spinning our wheels in a fruitless effort. Now, we who know God's love should treat one another as equals, no matter what our social status might be. If that isn't happening, then it's a strong indication that there's a problem. We should never push others aside as if we're better than them or as if they're beneath us from a social standpoint. We should refuse to take for ourselves in a way that deprives others or makes other people feel less loved. We should also share with others so they can have a bit of the good stuff in life. I also believe that most teaching on the phrase, "in remembrance of him," in verse 25, has gotten skewed. It isn't referring to a type of somber funeral memorial type of a remembrance. It means to remember that Christ came to show us God's love, and that we should share that love with others. We're here remembering God's love and goodness and remembering to share it with others. So Paul is telling people to remember to always show forth God's love. It also means that when you have a fellowship dinner, make sure everyone gets treated with godly love there as well. So make sure everyone can have something to eat. No one gets left out, and no one gets treated in a shabby manner. He's also telling them to treat this like it's a celebration of God's love, as if it's an enjoyable party for everybody, and everybody's invited. Now, whether you attend a typical conventional church or not, I hope these things can help. I also hope that these ideas show we can all be friendly to one another, because any division over this matter is really unnecessary. I hope this makes this subject a little more clear and easy to understand as well. Now, seeing these things, I'd suggest that you try to have communion at home at least once in your lifetime. This is what many house church groups do. You should partake of it as a meal. The first part can be remembering that God's love gives us strength, just like solid food. So then take a bit of a sandwich or some good cooked food instead of a little teeny nibble of a cracker. I'd then take a glass of whatever you like to drink with your meal, then tell everyone that just as good drink nourishes us and helps us swallow our food, God's love is the same thing. It helps nourish us and helps us swallow and accept more of God's love. Then drink from your glass. Then finish the rest of your meal. I'd also suggest either inviting some poor folks or poor folks in your group. You might also want to take some of the extra food to the poor and help feed the poor. I'd even suggest you share with some single folks, especially if they either don't know how to cook or don't have much money. It would really help them out, and it would likely help them feel loved and accepted. I've even heard of one group that has a meal together at a restaurant on most Sunday nights. During this meal, different people might stand and share something that's on their heart. One person might read poetry, some will sing a song, some stand to say a few words about what God is doing in their life. I think some of those folks might even pay for the meal for the ones that don't have much money. To me personally, this has more to do with the Lord's Supper than any service with sad funeral music. It's a lot better than sitting in silence to remember all your foibles and failures in life. We should look forward in life, not back to our failures that only serve to make us depressed. I like the thought of eating together like those folks did, where they shared God's love and met the need for food, and also gave an encouraging word to each other. This reminds me of something else. We also need to make sure and remember that this isn't to be like a funeral service with sad, somber music. As I heard one guy put it, this is a whoopee time. It's party time. And we get to celebrate all the good things that God and God's love has brought into our lives. It's also to remember that our life before we got to know God's love was like the misery of slavery in Egypt, so to speak. Yet when we fully give ourselves over to God's love and live in His love, it frees us and brings us strength to come alive. So the kingdom within comes alive, and we get to enjoy the glorious things that come along with it. Some of the original languages in the Bible show that it means we have an effervescent higher quality of life. The effervescence is like the fizz when you pour cola or soda into a glass too fast. The fizzy foam spills out all over the place around the glass. This is what God's love should do. It should spill out and enhance the lives of everyone around us. That's what God's love and celebrating it should do for all of us. Now, if anyone wants a few good resources to help with this subject, here's a few that I know about. One, you can look at the book Reimagining Church by Frank Viola. Especially look at Chapter 3, Reimagining the Lord's Supper. The second one is, you can look at Growing in Grace by Bob George. Especially look at Chapter 9 titled Freedom from Guilt. You should especially look at paragraphs 25 through 29. It starts at the phrase, one place where you can see our common failures. That's where he starts to talk about the Lord's Supper. Number 3, you might also look at the teachings of Mr. Gail Irwin that are on his website called servantsquarters.org. You can then click on the button at the top labeled Listen and Download. Then on the page that comes up, go to the bottom of the page and click on the button labeled Download or Listen to Gail's Teaching. The next page that comes up has a long list of teachings, and you can scroll down to number 41, which is labeled Communion. You can listen to that and download it and listen. You can also find his article on communion on his website. Once again, he has a few different beliefs, but I think he has good insights on communion. I've met him in person, and he is a friendly person. Number 4, you can see a bit of Wayne Jacobson's views on communion on his website, lifestream.org. You can go to his website search box and look for 2 of his articles. One is titled The Lord's Supper at Your Table, and the other is titled Communion at the Dining Room Table. Number 5, you can also look up an article by Steve Atkerson at his website, which is ntrf.org. ntrf.org. He has a few different beliefs, but he gives a lot of good insights on communion. I think you can also get a free download of his article about communion on his website as well. You can also find Steve Atkerson's video about communion on his website and on YouTube as well. You can find his YouTube channel by using the YouTube search box and type in Early Church Practice Today, NTRF. Steve Atkerson's article also cites a few scholars, and I'll name them and the things that they have accolades for here. 1. Donald Guthrie is the author of the book New Testament Theology. 2. Gordon Fee is the editor of the book New International Commentary on the New Testament. 3. G.W. Grogan, writer for the New Bible Dictionary. 4. C.K. Barrett, author of many commentaries on books of the Bible. 5. John Gooch, United Methodist Publishing House editor. 6. J.J. Pelican, Yale professor and author of many books on Christian thought and culture. The 6th resource is Malcolm Smith. You can go to his YouTube channel by looking up his name, Malcolm Smith. When you get to his channel, you can go to his channel's search box and look up the term Lord's Supper. You can then click on some of those and listen to some of his teachings on the matter. I've also recently heard he now has a book about it on Amazon. The book is titled Meal of Mystery, Meal of Wonder, and that's by Malcolm Smith. Well, before I end the show today, I'd like to give you a word of encouragement. As always, I hope you get acquainted with God's love for yourself. I hope that you know that you are loved by God, God will always love you, and God's love is unconditional. That's something we should all remember and cherish. As for now, I'm Lenny Manning saying, I hope you have a great day, and I hope to see you later. Goodbye for now.